Meu Deus.
I think we missed again Pedro Paulo. Zé Maria. Yeah. I don't know if I should begin or should we wait a bit more. We are already live.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So for those who are already watching us, we are having some technical issues related to internet connection of the coordinator of this seminar. I think we can wait like 30 seconds or 1 minute, and if he doesn't come back, I start the presentation and invite you to start talking. Is it okay?
Okay.
Yeah, that sounds fine.
Yeah.
We could wait until 10 after 9, or which would be 10 after 2 your time, just to make sure. Or
Yeah.
Here comes Pedro Paulo.
Meu Deus. Voltei ou não?
Sim.
Sim? Well, my name is Pedro Paulo Bastos. I'm proud to be the moderator of this seminar, which will be discussing the current trend of far-right administrations and movements in the Americas, in the Western Hemisphere. We're going to discuss MAGA movement and Trump administration in U.S. With the honorable presence of Professor Dylan Riley. Professor Dylan Riley, as a professor of sociology at UC Berkeley, has been publishing widely on these topics. I would mention, for instance, What is Trump, which appeared in New Left Review in 2017, and also recently, the 7 Theses on American Politics with Robert Brenner. Professor Dylan Riley has also researched the first instantiation of historical fascism. His doctoral dissertation was published as a book in 2010 called The Civic Foundations of Fascism in Europe, Italy, Spain, and Romania from 1870 to 1945 by Johns Hopkins University Press. And also he's just published a new book called Microverses Observation he has been published recently on the current conjuncture.
Okay, can everyone hear me? I guess I should get started.
Yes, I think you should, because we lost him again. So please,
okay.
You are welcome to start your presentation. Thank you
Okay.
again for being here with us. We are really excited to hear your words.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank, obviously, I want to thank Armando, and I want to thank Pedro Paulo, and I want to thank, everyone who's watching for taking the time to listen to me today. And also, I'm very excited to be involved in this collaboration. So thanks very much. Let me begin then by just kind of presenting a couple of ideas that I'm currently working on, trying to understand, obviously, what's going on in my own country, but also maybe putting that in a slightly broader context as well. Obviously, we're in a moment right now where there's a kind of avalanche of commentary about what has recently happened in the American elections. And so what I want to do, however, is to essentially take a slightly longer term view of these things. I want to do that in terms of just, in a sense, proposing a set of what I will suggest are some further theses on the U.S. elections, and some of these theses are going to be touching on things, very specific events. Some of them are a set of broader claims, and I'm just going to kind of forward them as a way of getting us to think through our current set of circumstances. So I'm actually going to organize my remarks in terms of sort of these three main categories. I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of political capitalism. That is something that I've been working on and thinking through a bit. And I think I will argue that that's kind of the fundamental context in which contemporary politics is unfolding. And I'm just going to touch on what I mean by that and the sorts of constraints that I believe that places on politics in the contemporary period. I'm going to talk a little bit then, following that, about the working class response to the overall situation of political capitalism. Particularly, I'm going to talk about understanding the fragmentation of the working class in relation to the syndrome of political capitalism. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the dilemmas of the left. And I'm mostly focusing here on the Anglo-American left, I would say. I may make a few remarks about, Brazil, but I think I will actually not do that, because I think that I would like to listen to what others have to say about that more than me. And obviously, Professor Taddei is going to be speaking about Argentina, and I want to hear very much what he has to say. And then I'm going to conclude. So let's get started. Just kind of what I'm going to say here. So the first idea I want to introduce is just the notion of political capitalism. And I'm going to begin then with my first basic thesis here. And the basic thesis is that the predominant political economic regime in the US in the contemporary period is what I'm calling political capitalism. And what is that? What do I mean by that? The idea that I'd like to convey here is that in the period around 1980, we see a very sharp break with the preceding regime of economic accumulation that had characterized the US economy and, of course, the world economy over the 30 glorious years that followed the Second World War. So that preceding period, which Robert Brenner and others have characterized as the long boom, was really characterized by a strategy of economic investment in which capitalists were investing in means of production, and they were essentially appropriating gains from growth. Basically, this was a strategy of extracting, we could call it in Marxian terms, relative surplus value from the working class. It was this economic period, just to gloss this very generally, was really the basis of the social democratic class compromises that characterized the rich countries of the OECD area in the period after the Second World War. Working classes consented to capitalism in part because of the gains, because they could enjoy some of the gains of growth, and the gains of growth were being produced by systematic investment in means of production, which were obviously increasing the efficiency of labor and allowing for capitalists to reap profits on that basis. What happened, obviously, in the 1970s was the onset of what has been termed the long downturn. That long downturn continues into the current period. In fact, I just saw an article by Martin Wolf in the Financial Times, which is just the latest recognition of this fundamental problem of growth, and actually also a fundamental problem of lowering increases in labor productivity over the long period. Now, this transition from a regime of high growth to a regime of low growth is really important in understanding the new political economic regime. Let me just present, I mean, this is not anything earth-shattering. I'm sure you guys have seen a version of this before. This is just taking from the Madison data on per capita GDP growth. So these are obviously rates of GDP growth over, and this is smoothed in a 5-year average. So taking these 6 leading economies, what we see, if we look here, this is a standard story. You can see very clearly here a period of the long boom followed by a period of the long downturn. And, for all of the talk of the recovery under the Biden administration and in the most recent period, you can see that GDP growth is still very, very low by historical standards. Now, the argument that I am suggesting here is that the response to this on the part of capital is really quite important. That is to say that what happened is that capital essentially shifted its strategy away from making investments in labor-saving technologies and means of production toward instead what could be thought of as a more direct appropriation of the surplus. Therefore, what happened instead of an economy characterized by high rates of growth driven by investment, that is to say, the pursuit of relative surplus value, what happened was instead a turn toward politically mediated forms of appropriation. There are many, many different specific sort of mechanisms or ways in which this happened. One of the ones that's been talked about most extensively in the literature, of course, is the pursuit of shareholder value. So that is to say, a strategy of basically to downsize and distribute rather than to invest, as, for example, William Lazanick would put the point, right? In conceptual terms, we could think about that in again, to use a kind of Marxian language, you could think about that as a pursuit of absolute rather than relative surplus value. Therefore, instead of appropriating gains from growth, what you have is a much more zero-sum type of struggle in which capitalists are actively using political mechanisms to appropriate surplus from the working class. That's just very general terms. That strikes me to be the context of the turn to the right, particularly in the United States. That is to say, a much more, you could say, redistributive rip-off economy than we had seen over the period of the long boom. Now, what happened with Bidenism? So this is to introduce my second thesis here, and this is the second thesis under the heading of political capitalism. Bidenomics was, you could say, in some ways, highly impressive. That is to say, there was a very significant expansion of, of a stimulus to invest, and that came under the heading, the 2 main pieces of legislation here are the Inflation Reduction Act and the Chips and Sciences Act. But fundamentally, these were basically took the form of tax breaks and handouts to businesses. They certainly did spark some investment, but it is likely that they sparked much less investment than, for example, would have been the case if the full package of Build Back Better legislation had been passed. The reason that it could not be passed, and this is something actually that I actually am indebted to Hugo for really documenting this very nicely in a recent contribution. One of the reasons, obviously, that the more ambitious Biden agenda could not be passed was because of the extraordinary power of financial interests within the Democratic Party. And of course, the rise of finance and the rise of that sort of capitalist segment is very much connected with the emergence of political capitalism itself, and has basically undermined very sharply the ability of the Democratic Party to act in such a way as to really engage in the sorts of industrial policy that the most ambitious segments of the Biden administration would have wanted to do. So Bidenism, in my view, shows pretty clearly, we could say Bidenism, and particularly the failure of Bidenism, shows fairly clearly the extraordinary constraints under which any strategy of trying to do industrial policy in the U.S. operates. That is to say, without a profound political confrontation with capital, one that is very unlikely to happen given the deep penetration of finance and the political capitalist dynamic within the American political system. Without such a confrontation, there is no way to really do the sorts of industrial policy that would lay the foundations both for a long-term breakout from the deep period of stagnation that we are in, and also to constitute some kind of social coalition that could pursue a renewed center-left policy. So, this is a really profound structural syndrome. So that's looking at it from the top down, as it were. That is to say, this kind of perspective is really focused on what's going on with capitalism and what's going on with the nature of the capitalist class, at least in the US in this period. Now I want to make a couple of comments about what the working class response has been to that. So that's going to turn to the next. Basically, I'm going to offer three theses under this heading of the working class response. So let's get into that a little bit. This is a funny little graph here that I want to explain a bit, just to give us a kind of conceptual grounding for how to think about working class politics in the period of political capitalism. I want to suggest that I want to suggest something general about how to think about working class interests. And the point I want to make before really getting into the details here is simply this: workers can pursue their material interests under capitalism in two very different ways. They, under certain highly particular conditions, workers may act as a class. That is to say, workers may act in terms of their relationship within the property relations of capital, so that they may come together on the basis of their position in property relations. That's class action. But the typical, and generally speaking, I would say, much more rational form of action for individual workers under capitalism is not to act as a class at all. It is to act as the proprietors of the special commodity that they own, that is to say, labor power. And the way to think about that, I think, is in terms of the circuits of capital. So you can, if you think about the main circuit of capital that Marx talks about with the MCM prime self-expanding value, which trundles along and is the basic dynamic of the system, you can conceptualize working class circuit as essentially a form of CMC circuit. That is to say, workers have a special commodity. That commodity obviously is labor power, which they exchange for money in return for with which they use to buy their means of need satisfaction so that they can reproduce themselves as workers on an ongoing basis. Now, because of that, because this is the way that workers enter into the capitalist system, it tends to be the case that they are highly interested in the protection and cultivation of their particular commodity, that is to say, their particular form of labor power. It is therefore very economically rational for workers to defend the value of their labor power in any way that they can. And some of those ways, as I will suggest, are very antithetical to the pursuit of class action. And the reason for that is because in defending their particular commodity or the value of their particular commodity, workers distinguish themselves from other workers. I have a certain credential. I am of a certain race. I have a certain kind of immigration status. So the pursuit of working class interests in this way tends to fragment working class. Now that's probably fairly obvious to everyone in one sense, but I want to suggest that under the syndrome of political capitalism, precisely because growth is slow and we are talking about zero sum rather than expanding pie, the tendency toward the fragmentation of working class is much greater under the syndrome of political capitalism. And this leads me to my third main thesis here, which is that wage earners under political capitalism tend to be profoundly split. And they tend to be profoundly split, in my view, along two main lines. One line is the education, non-education divide, and the other line is the line of race, ethnicity, and nationality. So what I would like to convey is that the idea is that in a situation of structurally low economic growth, what we have is a fragmentation of the working class as individual workers seek to defend the price of their special commodity, of their special form of labor power vis-a-vis one another. So I think, in other words, and I'd like to emphasize this again, there is a profoundly economic logic to the emergence of what is called, for example, in the United States, identity politics. Identity politics is not a completely satisfactory term because I think that education is also an absolutely crucial line of division within the working class. Now, I think that this is this poses a quite serious problem for the left, but I'll be talking about that. I'll talk about a little bit more when I get to my theses on the dilemmas of the left in a moment. Let me just move on here to my further thesis. Okay. It is not only the case that workers are split along the lines of education and nativity. There is also something extremely important going on with gender. And this is something that I would really like to emphasize. I don't think it's been emphasized enough on a lot of the left discussion, at least about Biden, from what I have seen. People have observed, and I guess most recently Matthew Karp, who I think is an excellent observer actually of American elections, has observed that the predicted support for Harris among young women was not forthcoming. It did not really work out in the way that it had been thought to. Nevertheless, there was a very, very profound gender split in the electorate, with men, and particularly young men, going very strongly for Donald Trump. And so there is a gender story here, but the gender story here is not so much about women. It's partially about women, but it is really a gender story about men. And that gender story is also very, very connected to the syndrome of political capitalism, or the capitalism of the period after 1980. How is that so? Here, I think we can think about the work of Nancy Fraser. And for some reason, my diagram here is not working, so I will just talk through this. What is happening here, and what has been happening, I would say, really since, you could say this has really been happening since the late 1970s. The downturn of the capitalist economy in the 1970s coincided with the mass entrance into the labor force of women. And of course, what that was an absolutely crucial feature of the period, because what happened was that at the same time as men were less and less able to earn what was called a family wage, that is to say, a wage that was sufficient to support themselves and their families, women entered into the labor force to partially compensate for the relative loss of wages of men. And so what has happened in the US, obviously, is a transition from what is called the breadwinner model to the universal breadwinner model. That is to say, from a model in which one person, namely the male breadwinner, supported a family, to the model in which all the adults in the home must engage in wage employment so as to sustain the wage for the family as a whole. Now, the consequences of this, there was a New York Times article. It was somewhat controversial article, but I thought quite clarifying, that came out just a couple of weeks before the election, which showed that in around 1980, non-college educated men were making about 7% more than the average wage, but that by 2022, they were making about 11% less than the average wage, which beautifully encapsulates the collapse of the breadwinner model. The graph for college-educated women was entirely the opposite. It showed a steady increase from the 1980, in which they were making less than non-college educated men on average, up until 2022, when they were making far more. The problem with this, and this is the thing that I want to emphasize, is that the transformation of gender relations described by the collapse of the breadwinner model and the emergence of the universal breadwinner model, and here I'm using, of course, Nancy Fraser's terminology, was completely associated with neoliberalism. So that the rise in the status of women was bound up very, very closely with the overall regime of political capitalism, with a shrinking economic pie, with stagnant wages, and with the general decline in the living standards, or we could say the relative decline in the living standards of the working class. This has created an incredibly powerful basis for reactionary gender politics. And reactionary gender politics were central to Trump's victory. I would just reference an important comment made during the campaign by Trump's vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, who talked about childless cat ladies. That is just, this was a kind of term that referred to, career women without families. The reason that this kind of comment is so powerful is because, of course, women's improved status is associated historically with the regime of political capitalism and the low wages and insecurity of working class men. And so that is something that is a really, really big problem. Now, let me turn to another thesis about this. In general, it has to be said, and this is something I think that is hard to say, but really important to say. In the rich world, Native workers without a college degree are increasingly the core constituency of the far right. And the evidence for that is about as clear as any evidence from social science can be. This is true in the United States. This is true in France. This is true in Germany. This is true in the UK. Obviously, in the recent elections in my country, the Harris campaign lost men without a college degree, rather, by historically large margins. This is often glossed, obviously, under the heading of class de-alignment. There is a big discussion about this, but it is an absolutely central fact that I believe needs to be faced pretty forthrightly. Now, what are the explanations that we have for this fact, for the emergence of this increasingly working class based right? There are two basic explanations of this. I think that neither of these explanations are particularly compelling, but let me just lay them out for you. The first explanation is that the turn of the working class to the right, the turn of, we could say, to be more precise about it, the turn of a segment of the working class to the right is the consequence of the betrayal of the center left. Okay, so center lefts have failed to pursue a rational electoral strategy. I believe in general that this approach is not satisfactory because it cannot explain why all center lefts across the rich world would make the same strategic mistake over and over again. This strongly suggests, that is to say, the generality of this process strongly suggests a much more structural explanation is necessary, or at least a much more general explanation is necessary than just, the Democratic Party is particularly bad at conducting elections because they don't understand how to win workers. I think that basic line of analysis is simply falls down in the face of the generality of this phenomenon. And the second argument that is put forward, which was probably most fully developed by two political scientists from Harvard, Pippa Norris and Roland Inglehart, suggests that there has been a cultural backlash. So somehow workers are threatened culturally by the rise of what they call post-materialist values. The problem with that explanation, I actually appreciate one part of that explanation, which is that it tries to actually forward a general explanation of the phenomenon. The problem with it is that if you look at Roland Inglehart and Pippa Norris's book, Cultural Backlash, it quickly becomes evident that that is not what their evidence shows at all. That is to say, the evidence that they marshal for cultural backlash is completely not compelling. And the reason for that is because what they show is that every succeeding cohort is more kind of culturally tolerant of immigrants, of racial and ethnic minorities, more pro-environment than the preceding cohort. So there's no evidence of a backlash, at least in cultural terms. So how do we explain what's going on? I think I've already suggested the elements of an explanation, which is not that there is a cultural backlash. It is that it actually makes quite good material sense for workers to pursue their interests as basically in ethnic and also we could say citizenship terms under conditions of political capitalism. So when we're trying to understand working class turn to the right, we need to see that it has a material logic. That is to say, it is not really, you could say, cultural in the Pippa and Norris sense. In fact, I am quite sure that many workers who are, not in any way more intrinsically nativist or racist than many who voted for the center left do support the nationalist right, because they see that political force as offering at least some protections for the value of their labor power, particularly when the question comes to the matter of immigration, which the right is particularly potent on. Okay, I'm going on a little too long here, so I'm gonna cut my presentation just a little bit short by going to talk about what this general syndrome poses to sort of left politics in this period. And I'm just going to talk about a couple of things under the heading of the dilemmas of the left. The most important thing that I want to get across here is that the problem, and this is particularly so in the US, is that in the current moment, because of the interaction between the rise of political capitalism and the reaction of workers and the way that that has now shaped the working class, the left in the US in particular lacks any plausible social agent for its politics. The left is on the horns of a dilemma, and that dilemma is essentially this. Either one can embrace some kind of compromise with nationalism and nativism, that is to say, a kind of, you could say, national Keynesianism, or one can embrace the ideology of progressivism with its ideas of equality of opportunity, expertise, openness, and tolerance. Those are the two major positions that are on offer. I think that the first position, whose I think most impressive intellectual exponent, is Wolfgang Streck, who suggests that the way out for progressive politics is to embrace what he calls the defense of stateness of modest dimensions, is ultimately rather a problem, since it does, in fact, imply a certain rejection of the universalistic values that have always characterized the left, while the embrace of technocratic progressivism and left neoliberalism has all the problems that we are already familiar with. That is to say, it has the problems that are associated with a discourse of equal opportunity and merit, but can be obviously is fundamentally not egalitarian, and also fundamentally alienates the working class. So I guess I should conclude by saying that it strikes me that the only way out of this set of political syndromes is to embrace a politics that attempts to polarize the political system along the lines of wage, labor, and capital, which refuses a nostalgic attachment or definition to industrial workers, but which equally refuses the slide into the embrace of technocratic progressivism and meritocracy, which has shown itself not only to be politically unattractive, but also to be a disaster in the electoral arena. I think I'll stop there. I have other things to say, but maybe we can leave that for the Q&A, and I don't want to go on too long. Thanks a lot for listening to my comments.
Thank you so much, Dylan Riley, for your presentation. Very interesting. I will comment after both presentations and ask some questions. So let's give the word directly to Emilio Taddei. Emilio Taddei has a master and doctorate in political science from the Institute of Political Studies of Paris Foundation Nationale de Sciences Politiques. He's adjunct researcher at the UBA CONICET, attached to the Institute of Latin American Caribbean Studies of the Faculty of Social Science at the UBA, Universidad de Buenos Aires, no? Member of the Latin American and the Caribbean Political Studies Group, and he's full professor of Political Science and Government at the National University of Lanús, UNA, in Argentina. Thank you so much, Emilio Taddei, for accepting this invitation. We also give you between 30 and 40 minutes, please. You can start the presentation. Thanks again for being here with us.
Thank you very much, Hugo. I'm sorry, Dylan, but I will speak in Spanish. So I prepared some slides translated in English, okay? Bueno, buenas tardes. Quería agradecer en primer lugar al profesor Armando Boito por haberme convidado a esta actividad y también, digamos, por haberme invitado a participar del proyecto sobre neoliberalismos y relaciones de clase en Brasil. Yo voy a hablar esencialmente, y en ese sentido va a ser una exposición, por lo menos en la primera parte, menos conceptual que la de Dylan. Voy a hablar sobre la experiencia del primer año del gobierno de Javier Milei. Ayer se cumplió un año, y justamente a 12 meses de comenzada esta gestión, el gobierno concluye el primer año en un escenario que está caracterizado por, en primer lugar, el control relativo de algunas variables macroeconómicas que está facilitado, digamos, por el ingreso de capitales argentinos fugados al extranjero y que regresaron en los últimos meses amparados por un blanqueo de capitales que impulsó el gobierno, y al mismo tiempo, digamos, esta situación de control relativo tiene que ver con la liquidación de las divisas del sector agroexportador. Otro elemento que caracteriza la actual coyuntura de un año de gobierno es una disminución relativa pero visible de la inflación, y este hecho en los 2 últimos meses le permitió al gobierno estabilizarse o mejorar, mejor dicho, la imagen presidencial en las encuestas de opinión. Y un tercer elemento que caracteriza este momento es la implementación por lo que nosotros llamamos decretos de necesidad y urgencia de una cantidad enorme de medidas de desregulación económica en diferentes sectores de la economía. Y este recurso a los decretos de necesidad y urgencia es un elemento central, una herramienta central que le permite al gobierno avanzar con su plan de reformas, evitando en muchos casos las negociaciones con el Congreso Nacional, donde se encuentra en minoría y en una posición de debilidad relativa. Después voy a volver sobre esta cuestión. Bueno, el gobierno, digamos, inició su gestión con una serie de medidas radicales que vamos a explicar cuáles fueron, que profundizaron de una manera inédita, que no tiene antecedentes en un periodo tan breve de tiempo, la concentración de la riqueza en la Argentina, profundizando así la tendencia que se había iniciado o recuperado, digamos, esta tendencia a la concentración de la riqueza en el periodo de la pandemia. Y el correlato o la traducción es un brutal proceso de transferencia de riqueza del trabajo al capital, que está marcada por la degradación de la situación social de las clases populares y de los sectores medios, que están siendo sometidos, o estamos siendo sometidos, a un proceso de empobrecimiento planificado. Doy algunos datos de los resultados provisorios de este experimento neoliberal, autoritario y, digamos, como yo puse en el título, que califico de neofascista periférico, que tienen que ver, digamos, con la decisión inicial al segundo día del gobierno de provocar una devaluación del 118% de los ingresos de los trabajadores y las trabajadoras. En este periodo de tiempo transcurrido entre noviembre del año pasado y septiembre de este año, el salario cayó un 6,8% y el desempleo aumentó del 5,7 al 7,7 en entre el primer trimestre del 2023 y el primer semestre de, primer semestre del 2023 y el primer semestre de 2024. La pobreza se incrementó en 12.8%, en el mismo en 12,8 puntos en el mismo periodo, y pasó de 40,1 a 52,9, 53%. La indigencia en mi país se duplicó en este tiempo y pasó de 9,3 a 18,1. El Producto Bruto Interno cayó 5,2 en el primer trimestre, es decir, una caída brutal del Producto Bruto Interno en el primer trimestre y 1,7 en el segundo, y hay una proyección de caída de 3,8% para el año. También otro de los elementos muy palpables es la caída del consumo, un derrumbe del consumo, que cayó 6,6% en el primer trimestre y 9,8% en el segundo trimestre. Y también, digamos, una caída de la inversión de 2,2 en este año. Entonces, a partir de estos datos, esperen que voy a ver si... acá está. A partir de estos datos, voy a focalizarme o desarrollar un poco esta presentación en base a tres interrogantes, tres preguntas, que son: ¿cuáles fueron las principales medidas económicas sociales o las más relevantes que tomó el gobierno libertario para avanzar con esta ambiciosa política de refundación del orden social en la Argentina sobre la base de los principios del mercado y, como dice el presidente, la defensa irrestricta de la propiedad privada? Ese es el primer interrogante. El segundo: ¿qué efecto tuvieron estas medidas en relación a los procesos de distribución de la riqueza? Y en relación a esta inquietud, voy a presentar algunos datos que permiten observar cuáles fueron las fracciones burguesas empresariales más beneficiadas por la política económica de Milei en este primer periodo, y cuáles son los sectores que se vieron más perjudicados. Y también vamos a ver un poco cuál es el efecto que estas medidas tuvieron en el mundo del trabajo y las clases populares y los sectores medios, ¿no? Y por último, espero que me dé el tiempo, la tercera pregunta, el tercer interrogante o inquietud es: ¿cuál fue la incidencia de estas medidas en la dinámica de los conflictos sociales y cuáles fueron las disputas o los conflictos que marcaron este primer año de la gestión libertaria? Hay dos cuestiones que son importantes, pero que no me voy a referir por cuestiones de tiempo, que son, en primer lugar, a los procesos políticos que antecedieron la elección de Milei y que explican la emergencia de este personaje. Digamos que hasta 2021, o sea, hasta 2 años antes, era un personaje completamente marginal y desconocido en la vida política argentina. Lamentablemente de eso no voy a hablar, y tampoco me voy a referir a la política internacional de Milei, que tiene, digamos, un papel importante en la agenda de gobierno y en su proyección o en la tentativa de su proyección internacional como líder de la extrema derecha. Bueno, ¿cuáles fueron las principales medidas o medidas legales que tomó el gobierno? Vamos a ir viendo, voy a ir presentando esto en función de una línea temporal de este primer año de gobierno que está dividido o en el cual pueden reconocerse tres momentos importantes, tres momentos distintivos. Un primer periodo de gobierno que se extendió entre el inicio, es decir, el 10 de diciembre del año pasado, y el 28 de junio de este año, ahora voy a explicar por qué la fecha, y este es un periodo que yo llamaría un periodo en términos políticos de confrontación y tensión con lo que el propio Milei llama la casta política, es decir, la referencia a la casta es toda aquella clase dirigencial, política, empresarial, es un concepto a geometría variable, pero en todo caso, en boca del presidente, pero en todo caso refiere a aquellos representantes políticos, empresariales, periodistas, etcétera, que son los responsables del mal, obviamente, y de la decadencia argentina. Obviamente, el principal o la principal responsable o emergente de la casta política es la expresidenta Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. Pero entonces, este primer periodo es el periodo de confrontación y de tensión con la casta, en el cual el presidente buscó asegurar una mayoría política en el Congreso, mayoría política que no tiene porque es absolutamente minoritario, pero tejer una mayoría política que garantice la aprobación de las medidas y de las leyes que impulsa el gobierno, ¿no? Y para esto no dudó, y no duda porque lo sigue haciendo, en tildar a los legisladores de ratas, corruptos, defensores de los privilegios, etc. Y este primer periodo entre diciembre y junio es también un periodo marcado por la criminalización de la pobreza y de la protesta social a través de, entre otras cosas, a través de la represión, pero también del recurso a una categoría discursiva que es la gente de bien versus la gente del mal. Esto en términos de la visión sociológica de la sociedad de Milei es muy importante tener presente que la línea divisoria que establece es, así como utiliza la categoría de casta, utiliza la categoría de la gente de bien y la gente de mal. Obviamente la gente de bien son sus partidarios y la gente del mal es todo aquel que se opone a la utopía de la sociedad de mercado. Bueno, en este primer periodo de conformación del gabinete, que digamos expresa o denota la presencia de ministros que son representantes directos o funcionarios de grandes corporaciones de los grupos económicos, es decir, de la burguesía asociada en la Argentina, aún mucho más que en el gobierno de Macri. Bueno, en este primer periodo hay un primer antecedente legal que es muy importante en términos de las consecuencias económicas, pero también en términos políticos y de los contornos del régimen neofascista de Milei. A poco de asumir, Milei decreta o firma un decreto de necesidad y urgencia que se llama Bases para la reconstrucción de la economía argentina, en el cual, digamos, toma un montón de medidas, no tenemos tiempo para explicitarlas, pero lo que me interesa señalar es que este decreto de necesidad y urgencia establece o introduce modificaciones que afectan la vigencia de los derechos humanos y que desconocen estándares constitucionales y convencionales de la Argentina. Un ejemplo de ellos, por ejemplo, es la anulación a través de este decreto de la ley de alquileres y la desregulación total del mercado inmobiliario, lo que hizo o lo que provocó inmediato aumento de los alquileres, afectando el derecho al hábitat y a la vivienda. ¿Por qué menciono esto? Porque, y esto es interesante, digamos, a la hora de analizar las características políticas de este ciclo neoliberal, de autoritarismo neofascista neoliberal que se despliega en América Latina, porque lo que introduce este decreto es un principio de excepcionalidad política, o de excepcionalidad a la norma democrática, a través de la violación de los principios constitucionales. Este decreto también propone o decide, digamos, avanzar con la privatización de una serie de empresas, en particular la empresa de aerolíneas argentinas, que fue colocada desde el inicio del mandato de Milei como el caso emblemático de privatización y de descrédito, de ataque a los sindicatos, de estigmatización de la empresa y de los trabajadores y sus gremios. Por otro lado, en este primer periodo, otra de las cuestiones que se pone en juego es el ataque a las organizaciones populares. Es decir, que la víctima inicial de las políticas de estigmatización son las organizaciones socioterritoriales, las organizaciones de la economía popular, y esto se va a traducir, por ejemplo, entre otras cuestiones, con la decisión del gobierno de dejar de enviar comida a los comedores populares de la periferia de las grandes ciudades. Este ataque a las organizaciones populares se va a complementar con un primer momento de criminalización y judicialización de la pobreza y de la protesta social, y se empiezan a dar los primeros hechos represivos a algunas manifestaciones contrarias al gobierno, ¿no? Bueno, este primer periodo va a concluir o se va a cerrar con la primer gran victoria política del gobierno en el Parlamento, que es, como decía anteriormente, se va a producir en el mes de julio, con la aprobación de lo que podríamos llamar es la ley madre de este gobierno, que es la ley que el gobierno llamó Ley de Bases y Puntos de Partida para la Libertad de los Argentinos. La aprobación de esta ley fue muy complicada, o sea, el gobierno utilizó la primera parte del año para construir para llevar adelante una negociación que le permitiera construir una mayoría en el Parlamento, porque, como dije, se encuentra en una evidente minoría. La construcción de esta mayoría, que, digamos, incluye a la totalidad de la coalición Juntos por el Cambio, que era la coalición de Macri, más algunos otros partidos, es la clave para la posibilidad que tiene el gobierno de hacer pasar leyes. La aprobación de la ley bases, como se señala acá en la diapositiva, permitió declarar una situación de emergencia, una situación de excepcionalidad en materia administrativa, económico, financiera y energética por el plazo de un año, y al mismo tiempo, y esto me parece que es lo importante, le otorga superpoderes al presidente Milei durante ese periodo de un año, y la facultad de legislar en estas áreas. Esto significa que la ley bases, y de ahí su importancia política, liberó o desató, digamos, las manos de Milei para avanzar en su propuesta de contrarreformas. El capítulo más importante de esta ley es el capítulo del régimen de inversiones para grandes inversores, o RIGI, que establece una cantidad enorme de ventajas para las inversiones de capital nacional, pero sobre todo transnacional. El RIGI está fundamentalmente pensado para llevar adelante o profundizar un nuevo ciclo extractivista en la Argentina, vinculado a la extracción, valorización de la renta de fundamentalmente 3 bienes naturales, que son el gas no convencional o shale gas, el petróleo de esquisto también, el petróleo de extracción por fracking, y el litio. Este régimen que está dentro de la ley bases está orientado a estos sectores industriales. Y aquí me permito hacer, digamos, una observación en relación a respecto al vínculo entre la dinámica del proceso político y lo que el triunfo de Milei significa en relación a un nuevo ciclo capitalista en la Argentina, al nuevo ciclo capitalista que, digamos, se viene desplegando ya desde hace unos años con el descubrimiento de estos yacimientos petroleros y gasíferos y de litio, y su inscripción su inscripción en el actual momento. Creo que justamente lo que significa o representa el triunfo de Milei es la posibilidad de control político de esta renta extraordinaria por parte de el bloque de poder en la Argentina, y fundamentalmente dentro de ese bloque al peso creciente que el capital transnacional tiene y tendrá en relación a el control de esa renta extraordinaria de gas y de petróleo. Creo que el bloque de poder que se está conformando en torno a y que apoya, digamos, la gestión política de Milei, tiene que ver con la apertura de este nuevo ciclo de valorización de esta renta extraordinaria. Obviamente, digo, en torno a esta cuestión hay tensiones, hay diferentes estrategias entre sectores burgueses nacionales, sobre todo en el sector energético, y capital transnacional, pero me parece que lo que viene expresando el gobierno de Milei es esencialmente esta capacidad de los grupos empresariales de apropiarse de esta renta extraordinaria, y no solamente de apropiarse, sino de apropiársela para su comercialización en el mercado internacional. Disculpen, voy a tomar un poco de agua. Bueno, la aprobación de la ley bases en este segundo momento del gobierno de Milei estuvo acompañada por una segunda fase de intensificación de criminalización y de judicialización de la protesta social. De hecho, el día en que se aprobaba la ley, hubo una manifestación donde hubo 33 detenidos que fueron procesados con cargos bastante importantes. Bueno, finalmente, producto de una lucha y una resistencia, se logró que esos detenidos salieran en libertad, pero la represión a esa manifestación contra la ley Bases constituyó un punto de quiebre en relación a la dinámica de la protesta social y a los temores de manifestarse. Por otro lado, si bien, digamos, esta ley fue un momento, digamos, un triunfo importante para el gobierno, en términos de las variables económicas, este segundo periodo fue uno de los periodos más complicados para el gobierno, con índices inflacionarios todavía elevados, y que hicieron, por ejemplo, que muchos sectores que habían apoyado en el Parlamento la votación de la ley Bases, para compensar lo que aparecía frente a los ojos de la población como una especie de traición política, votaron una ley que se llama Ley de Movilidad Jubilatoria para permitir un aumento y una recuperación de las jubilaciones, y sin embargo esta ley fue vetada por Milei y volvió al Parlamento, y aquellos que habían votado esta ley terminaron aprobando el veto presidencial. Esperen que... acá está la referencia sobre los principales leyes y decretos, de las medidas legales. Lo que me interesa, antes de abordar algunos elementos o características de este tercer periodo, es referirme a... bueno, estas son algunas de las consecuencias sociales a las cuales yo ya me referí, pero referirme a esta cuestión que tiene que ver con cuáles son los sectores ganadores y perdedores de la política implementada por el gobierno de Milei. Este cuadro, que no elaboré yo, sino un compañero economista a quien le agradezco habérmelo facilitado, es bastante elocuente en relación a los sectores ganadores de la política económica. Esperen. Ahí está. Bueno, en este cuadro se colocaron, digamos, en la parte superior, que están resaltadas en amarillo, los sectores, distintos sectores económicos y la participación que tuvieron los mismos en distintos periodos. Y acá, ¿qué se observa? Se observa que tanto el sector de la intermediación financiera, el sector agroexportador, el sector de transporte y comunicaciones, de energía, de minería, de pesca y de salud, que en Argentina tiene que ver con la existencia de un sistema privado de salud que se llama prepagas, pero todos esos sectores fueron beneficiados por las políticas de Milei. Y esto es interesante, los resultados operativos y los resultados netos de las empresas, de las 26 firmas más importantes de la Argentina, se quintuplicaron en base a la información disponible en los primeros semestres del 2024 respecto a los semestres de 2023. Es decir, hubo una quintuplicación de los resultados operativos de las empresas. Y en esta tendencia hubo algunos sectores que se despegaron sobre la media. En particular, el sector hidrocarburos, que tuvo resultados operativos de 709%, y el sector bancario, cosa que está, digamos, reflejada en este cuadro. Y en la parte de abajo se observa cuáles fueron, dentro de los sectores empresariales, los perdedores de las políticas de Milei. Fundamentalmente, sectores vinculados al mercado interno: turismo y hotelería, enseñanza privada, actividades inmobiliarias, y fundamentalmente uno de los sectores más perjudicados por una decisión inicial de Milei es el sector de la construcción, dado que a principio de su mandato Milei, para lograr los objetivos del déficit fiscal cero, cortó completamente la obra pública. Y esto, tuvo un efecto sobre la rentabilidad de los empresarios de la construcción, pero aparte tuvo un efecto catastrófico en relación a los indicadores de empleo, porque la industria de la construcción es una de las industrias más importantes en términos de contratación intensiva de mano de obra, ¿no? Esto en relación a los ganadores. Veamos ahora cuáles son los sectores que han sido perjudicados con la política de Milei. Y acá, para ello, vamos a ver este cuadro de ingresos, de la evolución de los ingresos de los sectores populares, y vemos la variación, o la pérdida, mejor dicho, la pérdida del poder adquisitivo en la mayoría de las categorías. En esta, por ejemplo, los docentes que pierden el 25%. Esperen, a ver si no me equivoqué. No, a ver, esperen, creo que... acá está, es esta. Digamos, este gráfico alterna la evolución de ingresos de salarios asistenciales, como por ejemplo este plan Volver al Trabajo, salarios docentes, la pérdida registrada por el salario mínimo vital y móvil, la pérdida de los docentes universitarios, la pérdida de poder adquisitivo, que es del 25%. En el único caso en este cuadro en el cual hay una recuperación después de una pérdida es en el caso de las jubilaciones, pero también, por ejemplo, se nota en una pérdida del 16% en el sector público, etcétera, etcétera. Aquí hay en la segunda parte del gráfico, donde, por ejemplo, se muestra la pérdida de ingresos de los beneficiarios de lo que se llama la asignación universal por hijo, la pérdida de ingresos de los asalariados del sector privado, que son, digamos, los que menos perdieron en algunos sectores, pero aún así tienen una pérdida de el 3%, de los asalariados no registrados, de los beneficiarios de la tarjeta alimentar y de los asalariados no registrados, que tienen una caída durante este año del 13%. En muchos casos, o yo diría que en una gran parte de los casos, esta erosión salarial estuvo o se vio incrementada por el fenomenal incremento de las tarifas de los servicios públicos, fundamentalmente de electricidad, gas y agua, que crecieron en promedio un 400%, ¿eh? Y este aumento que el gobierno habilitó se dio sin una reducción o una revisión de los costos de producción, es decir, no se les obligó a las empresas a explicitar los costos de producción y se les autorizó el aumento, y esta decisión contribuyó a multiplicar por 4 las ganancias operativas de las empresas energéticas. Y por otra parte, la desregulación del precio de los combustibles también encareció la canasta energética y multiplicó por 8 las ganancias del oligopolio petrolero. Bueno, quisiera terminar, porque me parece que se me está acabando el tiempo, refiriéndome al tercer periodo, ¿no? Que a lo largo de este año pareciera presentarse como el periodo de mayor gracia para el gobierno, o por lo menos el gobierno así lo presenta, porque muestra algunos indicadores, en particular el indicador o el índice de inflación, que ha bajado como una manifestación, como una muestra del éxito, del rápido éxito de las políticas ultra neoliberales y de las contrarreformas de Milei. Este último periodo, periodo que va de octubre a diciembre, es un periodo donde el gobierno efectivamente ha logrado bajar un poco los índices inflacionarios, que se habían ubicado, por ejemplo, en casi el 9% en abril, y en el mes de octubre la inflación oficial se ubicó en el 2,7%. Digo, esta diferencia o esta capacidad de reducción de la inflación ha sido real, pero también es importante mencionar que el sistema de medición de la inflación es un sistema viejo que data de hace 10 años y que no toma en cuenta la incidencia en los gastos de, por ejemplo, los servicios públicos, que son uno de los sectores o uno de los factores que más se incrementaron o que más experimentaron aumentos, como decía anteriormente, 400% en las tarifas de los servicios públicos. Entonces, al medirse la inflación sin ponderar correctamente la incidencia de esos bienes, el número da más bajo. Probablemente, ponderando correctamente, hoy estaríamos en una inflación del 3,5%, lo cual sigue siendo alta, muy alta, pero el gobierno ha celebrado este índice del 2,7 como una gran victoria. Por otro lado, y esto es muy importante tenerlo presente, en el mes de noviembre terminó la primera fase del blanqueo de capitales de argentinos en el exterior. Es decir, a través del primer decreto que firmó Milei, a través de la aprobación de la ley Bases, se habilitó un blanqueo para repatriar capitales que habían sido fugados. Bueno, el resultado de ese blanqueo ha sido bastante exitoso. En la primera fase del blanqueo, que sigue hasta el mes de febrero, pero con tasas más altas, pero en la primera fase, que tenía tasas impositivas menos altas, el gobierno logró ingresar 43.000 millones de dólares, que se sumaron a los dólares que fueron liquidados por el sector agroexportador. ¿Y por qué es importante la referencia a esta cuestión? Porque es la masa de capital fugado y que se repatrió más la masa de la liquidación de las exportaciones que le permitió al ministro de Economía, que es Luis Caputo, que es el mismo ministro de Economía, o mejor dicho, ministro de Finanzas de Macri, relanzar un ciclo de especulación financiera o de bicicleta financiera, como le decimos nosotros, o de carry trade. Así que, bueno, me parece que ya voy a tener que ir terminando. Me extendí más de lo que hubiera deseado, pero bueno, en todo caso podemos complementar. Simplemente terminar diciendo que esta situación de relativa estabilidad aparece, por lo menos durante la primera mitad del año que viene, muy vinculada a la capacidad efectiva que va a tener el gobierno de Milei de recibir el apoyo financiero de los organismos internacionales, particularmente el Fondo Monetario, y eso va a depender mucho de la voluntad y de la decisión política del gobierno estadounidense. Bueno, dejo por acá y en todo caso después me voy a referir a algunas cuestiones que tienen que ver con la protesta social. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Emilio. Thank you so much. Gracias también por su presentación. Voy a hablar en inglés. I want just to raise some questions. I will avoid also to talk so much because it's interesting to hear you both more. The first question I would like to raise for both of you is about this idea of neo-fascism and fascism as a concept to define the far right in the US and Argentina. I know that Dylan wrote about it, some articles about it, avoiding using this concept to define Trump, and Emilio does it, use mobilize neo-fascism to define Milei. So I would like to ask to Emilio, why? Why should we call Milei neo-fascism, peripheral kind of neo-fascism? How could you please develop the concept? And Dylan is the opposite. Why not? And based on that, I will do now, Dylan, for you some specific questions, and then I come back to Emilio also to raise some specific questions. I would like to hear, I suppose that you will talk when dealing with this question about fascism, you could talk about the concept, the idea of patrimonialism that you mobilize to describe Trump, this patrimonial style of rule. What I would like to hear about that, more than the relation with fascism and why not fascism, is the relation between this specific form of rule and the political regime that you described in the beginning of presentation, political capitalism. How could we understand the specificity of Trumpism and the specificity of his style of rule, that is patrimonialist, under this a more general, structural idea, concept of political capitalism. That is why in this phase of capitalism, that is called by you, defined by you, political capitalism, are we witnessing the rise of this kind of political phenomena that is the patrimonial style of rule. Also connected to that, thinking about the second term of Trump, would you say again that it can be a patrimonial misfit? Or, so here I want to hear you about the idea of misfit, because now Trump is more, it seems to be more powerful than in the first time. Does it change the possibility of having a complete patrimonialism instead of a non-complete, as you defined, if I understood well, for the first term? Finally, I would like to hear you about the new unionism, this this phenomenon of the rise of union struggles and labor struggles in the last years, the past 5 years, I would say. How does it interact with the idea of the splits that you described in the working class? Are we witnessing attempts of overcoming the split through labor activity or not? It's not so big to say that. So how do you would describe the new union struggles that are happening in the US, and the relation between this and what you brought about the working class split and the working class struggles conditions? Those are my questions for you, more direct. And for you, Emilio, ahora puedo hablar en mi portuñol.
Fala português, não tem problema.
Eu gostaria de saber a relação com o macrismo. Como está a relação entre o Milei e as forças tradicionais da Argentina, e como o seu conceito de neofascismo dialoga com isso, né? Você diria que o Milei está logrando capturar o macrismo, ou é o contrário, né? O macrismo captura o Milei, né? Como se dá essa relação? Como a gente deve entender essa relação de poder entre o Milei e as forças de direita tradicionais da Argentina e o capital? A segunda pergunta é sobre os setores que perdem, os setores que perderam, que você descreveu. Qual é o comportamento político desses setores? Qual tem sido? São setores que estão indo para a oposição ou não? Como se dá essa relação entre os setores do capital que estão perdendo e o governo do Milei? E aqui eu trago só a título de exemplo que uma resposta óbvia poderia ser: eles estão perdendo, eles estão contra o Milei. Mas a coisa não é tão direta assim. Eu faço investigação na pesquisa aqui no Brasil com o setor da construção civil, que seria um setor que perdeu com o bolsonarismo em termos de investimento estatal. É a construção civil da área da habitação. Mas o que é interessante é que eles são profundamente bolsonaristas, né? E a minha hipótese de pesquisa é que os ganhos que eles têm com a superexploração, com o restabelecimento de condições de superexploração do trabalho, compensam, na relação direta capital-trabalho, compensam as perdas em termos de investimento público, né? Então, queria te ouvir como que você analisa o comportamento político desses setores que estão perdendo, né, na relação deles com o Milei, o governo do Milei. E, por fim, como estão os movimentos sociais, movimento laboral na Argentina. Teve muita luta esse ano. Como você definiria, né, o atual contexto em termos das lutas populares e do trabalho na Argentina? Bom, essas são minhas perguntas. We can now give back to Dylan Riley and then to Emilio. I think we have we have 10 minutes each, and then until 4. Okay.
Right.
Okay, great. Yeah, just thanks a lot for those questions. I guess so. On the general one, on the business about neo-fascism or not neo-fascism, I guess what I would say is that I think it is. So what I'm going to say kind of is going to bleed into the answer to your first specific question to me as well. But I want to say that what is really happening is obviously a structural crisis of capitalist democracy. And in that sense, it's similar to the period of the 1930s. But it's different in one important respect that we have to keep in mind, which is that in the 30s, there was a mass movement of the left. Obviously, that was also connected to the kind of example of the Soviet Union, especially in its early phase of industrialization, which posed a huge challenge that is simply not on the horizon. And so the organizational forms and the types of regimes that produced historical fascism were always thinking about and reacting to both their own domestic lefts and the countermodel of the Soviet Union. And this is just an absent factor, a largely absent factor in the contemporary moment. There are certain parallels. I mean, there are more than parallels, obviously. I mean, some of these individual figures, for example, around Trump, are fascists. You could even say that Trump himself is a kind of fascist, but it's not quite a fascist system, and it's not quite a fascist system because of the absence of this pressure. Nevertheless, it is a structural crisis of capitalist democracy, and I think that we are seeing the consolidation of something new. Now, about the specificity of Trumpism and its connection to political capitalism, your question is very acute, and you're right that obviously Trump cannot be explained through this long structural process that goes back now for almost 40 years, right? But again, what we have to understand is that, first of all, I mean, the first point is the obvious point, which is to say that Trump is only the latest domestic, in the terms of the United States, domestic appearance of a very, very widespread phenomenon. I think the kind of canary in the coal mine, to use an idiomatic expression, or the first indicator of this syndrome was Berlusconi in the Italian case. Right. And so what did it represent? What Trumpism is able to do, in a sense, and in a sense exemplifies, is again the hollowing out and the hollowing out of the political systems of the rich world, consequent on a new regime of accumulation that is cannot sustain the classic social democratic class compromise that was the basis of liberal democracy through the whole post-war period, right? So can the specificity of Trump be explained through the structural transformation? No. But can the crisis that allows for a figure like Trump to emerge be explained in that way? Yes. So that's kind of the way that I would think about kind of the relationship between those two different questions. Is the second Trump something new? Absolutely. This is a new thing. It is the biggest difference, and this is a totally unoriginal observation, but Trump has around him a fairly organized and dedicated cadre. I think that the probably the most important of these figures is the incoming head of the Office of Management and Budget in the White House. It's a man named Russell Vought, who will become very important in the new administration. He is the closest thing to having a practical and workable theory about how to transform the American state in the direction that Trump wants to go. And I think to kind of refer to Professor Taddei's presentation as well, I think that there is a structural similarity, given all the differences, between the two administrations, in the sense that they both conceive of themselves as implementing a regime of emergency. That's a very important point. That's very explicit in Vogt's writing. He's the editor of this project's 2025 stuff. I mean, obviously I can't talk about what the consequences of this are because he's not even in office yet, but it's very clear that this is a kind of, conceptually, this is a regime of emergency, and that is really something new and quite important, and not quite what Trumpism was in the first term, in my opinion. Finally, on union and labor struggles, very hopeful, but very limited. That's basically what I would say about that. Union density in the United States is still incredibly low. And, you know, it is a long, long road back, even to the 1950s. And we all know the kinds of obstacles that are in the way of constructing an actual labor movement that could really, really shape the politics, of course, of the Democratic Party, which is the key issue in the United States. One thing I will say, I mean, I take a slightly different view of this than many other people on the American left. I do not think that it is obvious that the electoral interests of the Democratic Party lie in the direction of a turn to the left. I think that's not true, actually. And the reasons for that have to do with the fact that the most committed Democratic voters now tend to be higher income, higher educated voters. And so there's a very strong political rationality for the electoral strategies of the Democratic Party. Even when it fails, it has a very strong there's a very strong electoral rationale to it. And I think that has to be taken seriously. So what is needed, of course, is a kind of transformation of the terrain of struggle such that the electoral interests of the party change. But that's a long-term project. So I'll stop there. Yeah, thanks for the questions.
Thank you, Emilio.
Obrigado. Vou tentar agora falar em portunhol, tá bom? Em relação à questão do neofascismo, né? Obviamente que já desde algum tempo, e sobretudo desde a experiência brasileira com Bolsonaro, o debate teórico, o debate conceitual, né, para tentar achar algumas categorias para dar conta desses processos que estão acontecendo na América Latina tem se aberto. Em relação com isso, eu quero reconhecer ou lembrar, né, intercâmbio muito frutífero sobre a natureza política do regime Bolsonaro que teve entre o professor Armando Boito, de Brasil, e o professor Boron, né? Aí tiveram um intercâmbio que eu achei muito, muito interessante em relação à tentativa de classificação e de conceitualização da experiência Bolsonaro. A questão é a seguinte, para tentar explicar por que eu coloquei, né, o significante de neofascismo periférico para identificar a experiência do Milei no título da minha exposição. Eu acho que ou seja, essas experiências, né, neoliberais com um perfil claramente mais autoritário e antidemocrático que as experiências precedentes que existiram previamente na década dos 90, no início do século XXI na América Latina, são essas novas experiências, o caso do Bolsonaro, mas, sobretudo, o caso do Milei, são experiências que emergem num contexto geopolítico diferente, o contexto da década dos 90 e do início do século, que é um contexto marcado pelo que comumente chama a transição hegemônica, termo que refere à disputa entre a hegemonia norte-americana em declínio e o surgimento e a consolidação da China, né? Então, em relação com isso, eu acho que essas experiências, eu não quero falar de neoliberalismo autoritário. Tem alguns autores que estão utilizando o termo neoliberalismo autoritário para se referir ao caso do Bolsonaro, o caso do Milei. Mas o problema é o seguinte, a própria gênese do neoliberalismo na América Latina foi autoritária. Está vinculada com a emergência das ditaduras militares, cívico-militares na década dos 70. Então, isso é de alguma forma, conceitualmente errado, porque o neoliberalismo, como fase específica do capitalismo, foi muito autoritário, né? Aquelas ditaduras tinham, né, aspectos do caráter fascistoide, né, que hoje reemerge em novas condições históricas. Então, eu acho que essas experiências, eu chamo de neofascistas, para dar conta que elas incluem na forma de governo muitas das tradições autoritárias, né, características de regimes autoritários fascistas, mas isso não quer dizer que a função, sobretudo econômica, desses regimes seja a mesma função que os regimes autoritários na Europa ou que o regime do Trump. E aqui tem um dado que é muito importante levar a conta, que é o seguinte: na maioria dos países da Europa, e no caso dos Estados Unidos, muito claramente, com esse novo triunfo do Trump, né, o autoritarismo está vinculado a uma política protecionista, né? Aqui na América Latina, e o caso do Milei é ainda muito mais claro que o caso do Bolsonaro, não se trata de uma política protecionista, se trata tudo o contrário, de uma política de liberalização comercial, mercantilização da vida, privatização, etc., etc. E essa diferença tem a ver com, eu diria, um locus de poder na geopolítica mundial. Ou seja, o neofascismo latino-americano são experiências, e o caso do Milei é muito claro, que tem o que estão tentando justamente criar as condições favoráveis para uma recuperação da hegemonia estadunidense na região da América Latina. E por isso que eu coloquei a questão do periférico, né, para diferenciar o conceito que pode ser utilizado na Europa ou mesmo nos Estados Unidos, neofascismo, em função do lugar na estrutura do poder mundial, né? Depois é óbvio, e aqui o que Dylan falava, eu compartilho também, uma das características e que eu tentei acrescentar no caso do Milei, essa questão do regime de emergência, né? Que está falando do fato que mesmo os sistemas democráticos liberais precários estão saltando pelo ar na América Latina. De fato, hoje, eu poderia dizer que mesmo que tenha o funcionamento formal, né, vamos ver até quando, do parlamento na Argentina, o governo do Milei se inaugura com um ato de exceção política às regras democráticas. Por isso que eu insisti com a questão desse decreto, tá? Então, isso em relação ao debate sobre o conceito de neofascismo e tal. Mas, em todo caso, o que eu estou tentando, pelo menos nesse momento da minha reflexão, é salientar o caráter periférico periférico dessas experiências autoritárias, neoliberais e neofascistas na América Latina, tá? E isso, eu acho que isso vai ter uma importância crescente na medida em que o governo do Trump justamente vai tensionar, vai tentar a recuperação da hegemonia imperial americana em tensão, não só com a China, mas também com o México, com muitos dos países latino-americanos, sobretudo com os países onde tem governos de esquerda e progressistas. Segunda questão, a relação do macrismo com o mileísmo, né? É uma pergunta excelente, porque justamente o final do ano e o êxito relativo do governo do Milei marca a tentativa do Milei e dos grupos políticos de liquidar o macrismo em termos de força política, né? Eles precisaram, e isso é muito interessante, porque a chegada do Milei ao poder foi possível pelo fato que o macrismo mandou votar nele, né? E aí aportou 24% dos votos da candidata do macrismo. Mas o Milei entendeu que para ele poder governar tem que enfraquecer o macrismo, né? Então, isso explica também as dificuldades, as idas e voltas que tiveram as negociações parlamentares durante todo esse ano, né? Mas agora eu acho que o próprio Macri está numa situação muito complicada, né? Porque, obviamente, a legitimidade, que vamos ver se ela vai durar e quanto, mas a legitimidade do governo Milei é uma oportunidade para ele de quebrar a maioria liberal conservadora nos grupos da direita e assentar uma maioria no bloco da representação política da direita, uma maioria libertária, tá? Então, isso eu acho, essa questão vai acompanhar e marcar o pulso político argentino o próximo ano, porque as eleições são no final do ano, né? E a questão essencial para Milei é se constituir como a primeira força política dentro da família das direitas. Por isso também que ele está tensionando a relação dele com a sua vice-presidenta, que é a representante dos setores do nacionalismo reaccionário militar, né? Que foi necessário obviamente, para a vitória eleitoral, mas que não compartilham, né, o conjunto da política do Milei. De fato, tem uma tensão, por exemplo, com esse setor que representa a indústria militar, porque o Milei quer privatizar o pouco que queda da indústria militar. E esses setores que foram com eles nas eleições e que apoiaram eles, agora estão tendo tensões. Em relação ao comportamento político do que poderíamos chamar frações do bloco dominante, que são prejudicados pela política do Milei, eu diria o seguinte: obviamente, sobretudo, por exemplo, no caso da União Industrial Argentina, está tendo tensões e tal. Mas, em termos gerais, eu diria que a capacidade das frações principais do bloco de impor, diríamos, uma disciplina política capitalista faz com que, atualmente, esses problemas não se traduzem em uma crise dentro do próprio bloco e se traduzem numa crise de governabilidade. E aqui tem um dado que é muito interessante, que é o seguinte: a própria lógica de valorização financeira faz com que alguns desses grupos que estão perdendo, dos grupos industriais, dos setores industriais, que estão sendo prejudicados pela abertura comercial do Milei, eles têm a capacidade de recuperação de uma ganância no processo de valorização financeira. Então, a valorização financeira funciona também como uma espécie de colchão para... não sei como se diz em português, mas para aplacar as tensões, né, dentro dos próprios setores empresariais. O problema é o seguinte: agora nós estamos num momento de festival de especulação financeira na Argentina. Não? Esse festival, como eu dizia anteriormente, está sendo possível pelo ingresso, né, dos capitais que tinham sido fugados há 10, 15, 20, 30, 35 anos na Argentina. A Argentina é o único país do mundo que tem o mesmo volume de capital no exterior que o volume da deuda externa, tá? Então, esse é um dado a ter em conta. Mas o problema é o seguinte, esse festival, esse carry trade, né, que alguns jornalistas estão chamando populismo financeiro do Milei, né? Esse carry trade que está atingindo valores impressionantes. É muito, do ponto de vista econômico e do ponto de vista da estabilidade política, é muito instável. Por quê? Porque se o Trump, quando ele começar o segundo mandato, e a Fed norte-americana elevarem as taxas de juros, esse capital vai sair diretamente para os Estados Unidos, o que pode provocar uma crise danada na Argentina. Perante isso, eu acho que, obviamente, tem, sobretudo, o ministro da Economia está fazendo o cálculo, né, que se isso acontecer, os investimentos no setor petroleiro, no setor energético, vão permitir compensar. Mas isso é uma incógnita, né? Sobretudo porque os investimentos no setor energético levam muito mais tempo. Então, esse é um dado que eu acho fundamental e por isso que eu acho que a relação entre a experiência do Trump 2 e a experiência do Milei é muito importante, né, para o sucesso do experimento político do Milei. Mas tem outro ponto que você falou em relação à experiência brasileira. A contrarreforma trabalhista, que foi incluída na Lei Bases, funciona também como um elemento aglutinador das diferentes frações do bloco burguês do poder aqui na Argentina, né? Ou seja, a redução de custos do trabalho também permite, né, mesmo que tenha perdedores e tal, permite uma recuperação da rentabilidade empresarial. E, por último, a questão das forças populares, do protesto social e tal. No início do governo, teve várias manifestações, né? Aí, depois, isso foi... Ou seja, é interessante dizer o seguinte, desde que o governo começou, não teve momento nenhum em que não teve conflitos sociais. Isso não quer dizer que a potência desses conflitos e a capacidade de articulação permitem uma mudança das relações de força. Isso, por enquanto, não está acontecendo. E isso tem a ver também, tem muito a ver com a crise política do peronismo, né? Que está fazendo com que tenha uma dispersão, né, na capacidade de unificar uma resposta em termos políticos que é muito grande. Então, mas agora, no final do ano, teve algumas, assim, com isso eu fecho, teve algumas novidades interessantes, a ruptura da CGT e a saída de um setor muito importante da CGT com uma perspectiva muito mais combativa, né? Mas eu acho que ainda vamos atravessar um tempo muito complicado em relação à recomposição de um bloco popular. Muito obrigado, Hugo.
Gracias, Emilio. So it's already 4 p.m. We are then finishing. Thank you both so much for your presentations. I don't know if you want to say something else, to add something else. Otherwise, we can close the session. I
have one point to make.
Okay. I asked that because I saw you raising your... Yeah, please. I can give for both of you 2 minutes more for final words, and you can raise
just
your
a
questions.
couple of minutes.
Yes.
It's just a question that
Great.
I had.
Great,
I mean,
go.
I thought it was a great. So this is very interesting. Your questions were great, Hugo. One question for Emilio. So I thought this idea of the peripheral, what you say is correct. That is to say that neo-fascism in the periphery is not protectionist, not mercantilist, is associated with transnational capital. What about, but how do we make sense of the Hungarian case? Because there, with Orban, I just have, this is just a question. I just don't know how to make sense of it. The basic discussion in, let's say, I would say in both in Brazil and in Argentina, from what I understand, is that we understand the transnational sector as being a key basis of support for the radical rights, which is sacrificing to a certain extent the national sector with the compensating mechanisms that you talked about. That is to say, financialization can act as a way of bringing them back together. But in Eastern Europe, which is also on that semi-periphery, it's a very different configuration. Orban has made an alliance with the national sector and the working class against the transnational sector. It looks a little bit more like classic Peronismo in that sense. So I'm just wondering, how do we put these, this is in a sense a very broad question, but how do we put these different sorts of rights with their very different sort of specific class configurations together in a comparative framework? I don't know, but
I don't know too. I can't answer because first of all, I don't know very well the Hungarian case, okay? And maybe, but I don't know, I'm not studying the European neo-fascist regimes, but maybe it's related with the European dynamics, European building, European Union building dynamics, and the links with the capitalist dynamics in Hungary or in Poland, or I don't know. But I'm not sure. I'm very ignorant about this dynamic in the Eastern Europe. Okay, it's all I can say, Dylan. It's all I can say.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. We need a theory of geopolitics and the different positions of these. Yeah. Anyway.
In any case, I think it's very important to consider the subaltern status in the case of Latin Americans neo-fascism. Okay,
that was very clear. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
And what is very clear is that we should keep the conversation between us on. Yeah, it's hugely impressive how connected we are by different ways. Of course, we are talking about very specific conjunctures, but here I'm referring to Brazil, Argentina, and US, but at the same time, it's not so different. We are very connected, and I think this conversation should definitely go on, and we should keep the dialogue, because we need to understand what's happening and understand better to better fight. Yeah, because a common understanding also is that we as left and organized labor, we are in a very bad moment, historical moment, and to overcome it, we need to figure out together. Yeah. So with this invitation of keeping the conversation on, I would like to close this session. Thank you again so much, Dylan and Emilio. Wonderful presentations. And hopefully we will be together again soon.
Thank you very much, Hugo.
Thank you very much, Hugo.
Yeah, great. Bye, you guys.
Bye.
Obrigado. Ciao.
Muy obrigado.
Yes.